saw in themselves, in their own lives. Indigenous people in different parts of the world, minorities all over the world, saw in themselves the treatment of George Floyd at the hands of American police. And I think we should do well to remember that this movement is not a movement that's going to disappear. It's one that actually empowers and unites people all around the world. I think we should approach this debate also with a sense of reality. The House of Commons Library has produced a very excellent briefing paper, as all their briefing papers are, Race and Ethnic Disparities in Britain. I urge members to read through it. Read through it very carefully, because what it shows in health, in education, in housing, in stop and search, in poverty, in the criminal justice system, and so much else in our society, if you're young, if you're black, you're more likely to be poor, more likely to be stopped and searched, more likely to be underachieving in school, less likely to get to college, even less likely to get to university, and have a lower life expectancy and a lower income expectancy in the future. These are devastating statistics here in 2020. All those years after we passed the first race relations legislation under a Labour government in the 1960s. We should not be so complacent, and this, what I hope will become an annual debate, should become a review of progress or not that is made in these matters. And so I would urge members to look very, very carefully at that. I've heard the speeches from members opposite, and they talk quite reasonably about the huge achievements of individuals who've broken out of that cycle of poverty. On this side of the House, it's not individuals that we want to break out, it's a collective response that we develop a system that provides decent education, housing and health opportunities for all, and recognise that we have to provide services that deal with the inequalities of which they face. As a councillor in Haringey in the 1970s, it was my honour to chair the Community Development Committee. The successor chair of that committee was my great friend Bernie Grant. And we saw in that the way in which we could put public resources into the most disadvantaged communities in order to empower and strengthen those communities to help them get the same chances as other young people all across that borough. So our approach on this side of the House is essentially a collective one. That's why we founded the National Health Service. That's why we developed council housing. That's why we developed so many other of our collective services in this country. But this debate also takes place not that long after the scandal of the Windrush business, shall we say, hit the headlines and hit this House. It was deliberately created hostile environment that led to the injustice of the Windrush generation, a generation that came to this country and gave so much in health, in education, in engineering and so much other work, and helped to improve the living standards of all of us. And ministers should not be unaware of the hurt that is felt amongst that generation about the way they were treated by that hostile environment. But I think we should also look at the way in which we treat migrants to our society. Why do we have so many people in immigration detention with no charge against them, held effectively in prison with an indeterminate sentence until the Home Office gets round to dealing with their case? We shouldn't be so proud or so complacent about what we do. And when we have a Home Secretary that talks about using the Navy to repel desperate asylum seekers and refugees who have risked all to cross the world's busiest shipping lanes to try to get to a place of safety, can we replace that rhetoric with the principle of humanity and an open heart to people all around this world? And in my constituency, like many others, I don't have to walk very far from my house, and I find people, asylum seekers, whose process is endlessly lost somewhere in the miasma of the Home Office filing system, with no recourse to public funds, sleeping on the streets, begging and looking for a meal from a church, a synagogue or a mosque in order just to get by. Let's have a sense of reality about what modern Britain is like and the degree of racism that is still there, sadly, in our society, and the way in which the far right are organising in order to try to make the situation worse. I think we should be full of admiration for those in the black community that have organised themselves, those in the former colonies that organised in order to defeat the occupation by Britain, by France, by Italy, by Spain, and so many other European colonial powers, and bring about independence. I would like our children in our schools to understand and see as a central part of the curriculum the significance of the Pan-African Congress held in 1945 at Chorlton-cum-Hardy Town Hall in Manchester, largely ignored at the time, but the future leaders of many African countries were there at that conference. And indeed, less than 12 years later, Ghana achieved its independence as the first African colony to achieve its independence. And that generation that came and organised the black community in Britain in the 1950s and 60s, John La Rose and other great poets from the Caribbean who founded New Beacon Books in my area of London, and did so much to empower and use the work of Claudia Jones and so many others in order to give a cultural strength and cultural value through carnival and so much else to what the Caribbean community were achieving here. And that black self-organisation that was opposed and then eventually accepted in the Labour Party did indeed mean that we had black sections, and did indeed mean that my great friend, the member for Hackney North and Stoke Newington, was elected to Parliament in 1987, along with Keith Vaz, Paul Boateng, and of course Bernie Grant, who is sadly no longer with us. It's those people that did so much. And others that paved the way to go into Parliament, like Dadabai Naraji in Finsbury at the turn of the century, and of course the great Saklet Vala in Battersea later on. So I think we should look at the history our children learn, not just in 1 month of the year. But I beg to differ with the previous members. I do want to see the decolonisation of our history. I do want our children to understand how black communities came together, how people stood up against the abuses that colonialism was and is against their lives, and brought about independence and helped to bring about, very briefly, because we're out of time.
On that very point, I was just going to say there are so many communities in this country where there are, we've talked about this before, statues, streets, etc., named after slave owners, colonialists. People like me who come from Glasgow, and we're immensely proud of Nelson Mandela Place being named after Nelson Mandela. We're completely unaware of the history of the names of the other streets round about that. That's the sort of thing that we need to attack when we look at education and black history.
And indeed, I love Nelson Mandela Place in Glasgow. It's fantastic. And if I may, through the honourable member, convey my congratulations to Glasgow University for recognising that it should repay the compensation they were given for the money they received at the end of the slave trade, because it is the issue of colonial brutality that I think should be taught to our children, and the way in which the slave trade enriched the already rich in Britain. And some of our biggest companies relied on the slave trade to provide them the profits from banking and sugar. And whilst the abolitionists often... sorry, I beg your pardon, yes.
Minister. I thank the Right Honourable Member for giving way. But does he not feel that by turning the curriculum into a list of all the things that Britain has done wrong to people of a certain race, they are actually distorting a history of our nation and not giving a true picture, not just of the activities of this country, but also activities of people who share my skin colour, which were not always as wholesome as people on his side want to make out?
It's not about distorting history, it's about the reality of history that should be taught. And that means understanding what the slave trade was about, what the brutality of colonialism is, and the way in which people were treated. And whilst there are many in this House who say that William Wilberforce was wonderful in his presentation of the abolition legislation in this very chamber, excellent, and that the Reverend Thomas Clarkson risked all to tour the whole country, explaining to people just how evil the slave trade was, and he showed them the accoutrements of torture that he took with him around the country. The reality is that the slave trade was abolished and slavery was abolished by the selfless bravery of slaves who rejected it in the plantations in the Caribbean and the Americas and elsewhere. And I would want our children in our schools to understand what those people went through. Paul Bogle, who led the Morant Bay Uprising, and of course Sam Sharp, who led the rebellion in Western Jamaica in 1832, brilliantly chronicled by my late great friend Richard Hart in his book, Slaves Who Abolished Slavery. And when Sam was taken to the gallows and executed, before he was executed, he said he accepted the laws under which he was going to be executed, and then went on to say, "I depend for salvation upon the Redeemer who shed his blood on Calvary for sinners." And he was then executed because of his part in leading the rebellion against the slave owners and the sugar plantations of Western Jamaica. But at that point, the sugar industry was in dire straits. They were losing money in London because the sugar wasn't coming because of the uprising, and that speeded up the process of abolition. And to its eternal shame, this House then voted what would now be billions in compensation to slave owners, but not to the slaves themselves. And there are many other books that I would want our children to read. My great friend Remy Capo and his book on Forgotten Harvest, a novel about the slave trade, a trilogy of novels about the slave trade, I think are the books that I would want our children to learn. So what I just say in conclusion, Mr. Deputy Speaker, is this. History is divisive at one level. It's endlessly controversial. To me, endlessly fascinating. History educates, history empowers, but history also forms attitudes and opinions. And so, if our children are brought up understanding that maths, that science comes, yes, from Europe, it also comes from Africa, it also comes from the civilizations of what is now called Latin America, it comes from China, and it comes from so many parts of the world. Our standard of living comes from those people that have used their brains to invent so much all over the world. But too often it's taught in the process of some kind of European supremacy over the rest of the world. It doesn't have to be taught that way. It has to be taught that way of the thirst for knowledge that empowers us all. And also to recognise that the great writers and poets that have come from the Caribbean and South Asia have enriched our lives massively. I love the work of Andrea Levy. She lived in my constituency before she died, and we unveiled a plaque in her memory, and her family all came to a little reception we held afterwards. And I met one of her nieces who didn't realise quite how famous she was, because she was in school and the teacher read a part of one of Andrea Levy's books to the class. And the teacher said to the class, "Well, what do you think of that?" There was a sort of load of blank faces. She said, "That was written by Andrea Levy." Then this girl's hand went up. She said, "Yeah, that was my auntie." She didn't realise she'd been the great writer at that time. And it was just a way in which we need to popularise the literature that's there from so many writers that have come to this country. My friend, the member for Leighton, mentioned C.L.R. James. I would mention also Derek Walcott and the great Asian poets like Tagore and so many others. Let's give our children the space and the opportunity to learn the history of this country, to learn the popular history of this country, of ordinary people's demands to get fair legislation, trade union rights, factory acts and so on, but also to understand what colonialism did and what colonialism did to the victims of it. That way, I think they'd have a better understanding of the way in which the world is at the present time. That, to me, is what Black History Month should be about. But I would like us not to have Black History Month, but to have Black History